Hello and welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, episode 22, Consent. This is something that has been popping up on my radar off and on over the last, several years. That has kind of, I think, come to a head, I suppose you could say, here recently. The question of consent with respect to what the game master's content, what the game content is going to be like versus what the players are expecting or are prepared for. And it's very contentious. The question of consent, the RPG consent checklist on my screen there and in my hand, for example, is very contentious. There are a lot of mostly older gamers who are very firmly against the consent checklist and say bad things about it. And there are a lot of, I would say, mostly younger players who are big believers in it. And so I'm going to try to talk about the situation. I'm trying to talk about why we are the way we are. I'm hopeful that both sides can see each other a little better after this. And I hope I don't make anybody too angry at me in the process. It would help to understand the older players, the older game masters in my age group. I was born in 1965. I am supposedly, they tell me, among the first of the Generation X generation. If you think about it, the original Dungeons and Dragons, the original war games and role-playing games from back in the day, back in the 60s and 70s, were created by boomers. It makes sense if you think about it. They were raised in an environment where colonialism was celebrated, where it was seen as a positive thing. I guess that's the way to put it. In an environment where we were told that civil rights was being addressed. No, really. I mean, the 1970s was when women first got the right to have credit cards in their own names, which stuns me to think that it took that long, but there we are. We thought of ourselves, Generation X, thought of ourselves as more enlightened than our parents on many of these subjects. We probably weren't. Maybe a little better, but probably really not all that enlightened. Generation X, at least as best as I can see, we were not just taught, but trained to accept that the universe wasn't fair, that bad things were going to happen to us and to people we liked, that there was no point in whining about it. We should just buck up and get over it and get on with it. There was no, not only was that would there have been no acceptance of trigger warnings, they would have been actively discouraged. Anybody that would have one of those problems where a trigger warning would be necessary should just stay home. I'm not advocating this position, to be clear. This is the world I was raised in. This is the America that I grew up in. I was taught as a man that I was expected not to have significant emotional reactions to things other than getting excited about sports, which I didn't, and so forth. So the idea of any kind of a consent checklist, it goes against that training. It goes against those beliefs that are deeply ingrained in most of us. If they remain unexamined, then they will continue to drive us. I mean, that's just how it works. So it shouldn't be surprising that so many grognards. Well, actually, I'm told it's grognier or grognier. It's a French word. I'll digress. I first encountered the word on Dragon's Foot as a term used to refer to fans of games from before 2000. Fans of the second edition and earlier of Advanced D&D, of the basic D&D, and pretty much any of the other old school games that came before Wizards of the Coast got involved in 2000 or thereabouts and put out the third edition of D&D. We were as they were described in Napoleon's armies, we were the old grizzled veterans who didn't like the way the new kids that were joining us were doing things. We wanted things done the way we'd always done them. There's a lot of truth in that. I always thought the word was grognard. I had no idea. I have a French-speaking friend who helped me out with this. Grognier. I think I have that right. I would suggest, though, that the modern use of the term really is kind of distinct. It has become an American RPG term, or maybe it's international, I don't know, but it's become an American RPG term referring to people who are big fans of the games from before 2000. We've kind of co-opted it. So I don't guess it matters if you say grognard or grognier. You're covering the bases either way. But that's us. We're the ones that started out playing the game that way, playing the game the way that it was given to us, where a certain degree of a fairly high degree of violence was expected. I mean, that's classic D&D. You go into a dungeon, you knock down the door, you kill the monster, you take its treasure. I mean, broken down to its minimum form, that kind of is how it works. And yeah, there are aspects of colonialism in the way our old adventures were designed. Even a lot of the newer adventures are that way. That's just, kind of something that's ingrained in our culture, I think. We were raised in that environment. So that's why the old guys, many of us, have a strong knee-jerk negative reaction to this checklist or the idea of it. But we also have that reaction, I think, for a different reason. Our groups were put together out of people that we knew, people that we met in person at game stores or at school or whatever activities we might have been involved in. We met people. They found out we were into the same thing. We'd introduce them to the game if we thought they were interested. We were building our groups out of people that we knew, people who largely had the same cultural background we did, mostly white males, white male nerds. That is predominantly what we had going. We had our stereotypes, being the guys that no one would date. Most of those guys did manage to get married eventually. So I've noticed anyway. But, however true or false that was, it was true there weren't a lot of women, a lot of girls involved in the game at the time. It was mostly a guy's game. And I will admit, I don't know a lot of non-white players. Most of the ones I do know are Hispanic, Latinx, whatever. However they identify, however their heritage works out. I haven't really known a lot of any other race, Asian or black people or anybody else. This doesn't mean that they're not welcome, although I can see how some of the themes and some of the adventures might make some of them feel unwelcome. Just that my experience of life, coming up from where I came from, this is what I saw, a bunch of white dudes sitting around a table playing games. We all had much the same expectations. We all watched the same TV and read the same books. With a few exceptions, most of us accepted that there would not be any overt sexual activity in a game, so the whole section of this related to sex. The fade to black option would be pretty much the option all the time. And the question of between PCs would have been pretty rare, or pretty weird. For most PCs to be having relationships with having sexual relationships with other PCs, that would have been considered weird. But even if we did have that, it would have been in the fade to black category. There were others whose games were more cringy than that. Not my thing. Not something that anybody I ever knew ever wanted to get involved in. As far as romance goes, romance divorced from sex, I don't think there's any reason we wouldn't have just had that, not deeply explicit, because that could get very boring for the onlookers, for the extra players who weren't actually involved in the scene. So we would probably deal with that in a hand-wavy way, sort of like the fade to black. And again, between PCs would be weird, but I don't suppose that would be that bad. That whole section of here, I get that. Grew up in a repressed era. That's just how it was. We all watched the same James Bond movies. We knew Bond did it with a lot of women, but he would embrace the woman of the minute, and they would kiss, and perhaps you would see him beginning to unbutton or unzip something. The door would close, and the next scene would probably be something violent. The other items on here, I find as an old guy, I find a lot of this rather strange. Because I'm accustomed to a game where we know bad things happen. Bad people exist, bad things happen. The story's going to involve bad things. Cancer, I don't know why I would ever have cancer pop up as an element in a game, but I wouldn't see it as a problem specifically. Claustrophobia. I don't know. Freezing to death, gaslighting, genocide. These are all gaslighting and genocide together. I mean, I know it's alphabetical, but that does seem kind of funny. These are all bad things that bad people do to each other and occasionally to good people. Or think bad things that happen to people, I suppose. Most of what's in that list are not things that anybody would make a big deal out of in a game from my generation. We would expect the possibility of freezing to death, for example. Claustrophobia for a D&D type RPG I don't think would really work very well one way or the other. Heat stroke, sure. Yep, you spent too much time in the desert and you died of it. We see that. Police and police aggression. Well, I'm thinking of the City Watch in most of the medieval games that I've played, and yeah, there are liable to be some fighting with the watch, with the local militia or whatever happens to be like. There are a few exceptions. I would categorize sexual assault over in the sex category. We're not doing that, and that would be a hard no for me as a game master as something to include, except distantly off stage, perhaps as a hint. This guy is so bad, and you rescue a woman out of his prison, and she doesn't have to tell you that she was mistreated. She was mistreated. You don't need to know how she was mistreated, only that she was. Or, it works. It plays both ways. It could be just as easily be a male victim of a male or female villain. That's not, even back in the day, that wouldn't have been an issue for me to understand that. It would never be overt in my games. But a lot of this stuff, starvation, torture, thirst, terrorism. I don't know about terrorism. I'm not sure I really see how that would fit into my games either. But, okay. Paralysis/physical restraint. This is the old school. Lots of monsters paralyze you. This is, I think this section, the mental and physical health section, is probably the part that causes the most cognitive dissonance to those of us in the old days. Most of the stuff that's on here is either, yeah, that happens every session, or when would we ever want that? There's not the yellow boxes would never get checked, because it would either be all this stuff is, these items are definitely hard-nosed, we're not going to have them in a game, and these items are all fair game because we got monsters that will cook you, we got monsters that'll freeze you, we got monsters that'll paralyze or restrain you, The basic fantasy core rulebook is full of them. Ghouls paralyze hangman trees, grab you and choke you to death. That's what they do. And in the horror category, bugs, blood, demons, eyeballs, gore, harm to animals, harm to children, rats, and spiders. Harm to children and maybe animals are the only things that would have been considered problematic back in the day. Back in my day, we would, again, those would have been far off stage. You wouldn't see it happen. It certainly wouldn't be described by the game master. Perhaps hinted at in the aftermath. You arrive in a city or village that's been burned down by a dragon, and there were children there. You would hint at that. Perhaps a toy would be seen in the street half burned or whatever, and it would give away the fact that there are children dead in the town. We wouldn't go over that in detail. It wouldn't be a detailed thing. That alone would be enough to energize player characters who needed a good reason to kill a dragon. Or if it didn't, that might be players I might not want to keep at my table. Is that edgy, writing the adventure that way? That's a hard question to answer. I've had this question come up on other adventures about whether a particular element of the storyline is meant to be some kind of an edgelord thing to emphasize how bad something is supposed to be, or whether it is just a legitimate part of the story. And the short answer is, certainly that's perception. And there's no way I can answer the question as to which way it goes. But bad things happen. Bad things happen in the real world. Bad things are definitely going to happen in a world full of monsters. There's just no two ways about it. But at the same time, I see the point of this. I understand this because many of the people who are doing these checklists are assembling groups of players out of people they don't know. People met at a library. That actually came off a library website, that copy did. People met at a game store. Maybe you saw an advertisement stuck on a bulletin board somewhere and you called somebody or sent somebody a message online or whatever. And, you coordinated and you first met that way. Maybe you walked up to a table at a game store with an open game and you want to join it, but the game master is aware that there may be problems and they have the checklist ready and they hand it to you. Maybe they hand it to you blank and you're supposed to fill it in. Maybe they hand it to you as a warning with marks for the things that they expect to be in their game, which actually I would kind of advocate in situations like that. But there's a generational difference here. The younger generation sees, this is my feeling, this is my opinion, this is based on what I've witnessed, what I've read, and what I've seen. The younger generations, the ones after Gen X, largely look at this consent issue as an important issue because of the interpersonal aspect of it. They look at the games they play much more as stories. I've said before, in the old school, we don't write stories. Story is what happens when we pick up our dice and walk into the game master's world. The story that matters there is what happens between the players and between the player characters and between the player characters and the NPCs, driven primarily by the player characters' actions and by a certain amount of backstory written by the game master. But the game master doesn't try to plan for what's going to happen, only tries to prepare for what might happen. In the new school, there is a story to the whole adventure, and you are going through it. So really, the consent question is connected rather directly to the question of railroading, because modern games are much more railroady, because they have a story, and they're trying to lead you through the various phases, chapters, whatever, of that story. So you get exposed to all of it, and you get to participate in all of it, and you get to be the heroes in the end, I suppose. But so this is a difference in the way they look at it. When you look at it in that fashion, when you are going to be more immersive from the first moment, the question of what the content's going to be like might be more important. I can certainly see that. And I'm not going to pick on anybody who thinks that for their game, for their experience in role-playing, that a consent form of some kind is needed. It's the same question as the session 0 question. The question about having a session where you just talk about what's going to be in the campaign. Never did that back in the day. Never ever did that back in the day. I don't believe I have ever really done a session 0 of any kind. Ever. Players that have come to my game have come to my world. And it is the way it is because it's the way I designed it and the way it has grown under the influence of previous players. If you aren't using a consent checklist, if you are not going to use a consent checklist, the very, very next question I have for you is, how are you letting your players know what your campaign is going to be like? How are you letting them know what to expect? And there is a question. If you're not telling people, you're springing stuff on them. I've seen lots of horror stories about that. Cringy game masters who conceal the fact that they're going to spring something horrifying on their players. Again, laughing about it, which is wrong to me. The objective of the game master is to create an environment where the players can enjoy the game, is to create an enjoyable game, is to make sure that everybody has something to do, at least part of the time, maybe not every moment, because that doesn't work, but everybody should have an opportunity to shine, an opportunity to do what they want to do, what their character wants to do. I had a joke about, RPGs allow you to do things in a game that you don't get to do in real life, like traveling, getting enough sleep, and being paid appropriately for what you've done. But there's a lot of truth in the idea that you go into an RPG to experience things. Many people go into an RPG in part to experience encountering evil and fighting it and defeating it. So the first question becomes, what is evil? What is acceptable as evil? So like I said, I've never had a session 0. I've never done a consent form. Players that come to my game are told, though. It's an old school D&D game. Right there, that should tell you freezing, burning, paralysis, physical restraint are definitely all on the table because those are all things that are built into the game. The game master is going to do those things. I have, in many cases, expressly explained the whole fade to black thing regarding sexual activity to players joining a game. Because I think that's important for them to understand that. We're not going to do what is, to me, weird, cringy stuff. We're not going to talk about actual sexual activity. We're not going to deal with any of those issues. It's just not something that I want to see. These are my friends. They're not welcome in my bedroom. I don't want to go into theirs. I sure don't want to know what's going on in their heads that way, and I'm assuming they probably just soon not get into mine. This is things that we don't want to deal with. These are things that we don't think belong in our games. If you're into that kind of thing, I am not making fun of you. But let me know before you invite me to a game that you're doing that, because I'm going to say no. That's just how it is. Yeah. So while I've never done the consent form, I have always, to some extent or another, tried to make clear to potential players what my game is like. The second thing here is a related thing, I should say, that I've heard from a lot of grown-years, is that they either have experienced, have heard about, or simply imagine as a possibility the use of these forms to strong-arm them into running a game in a way that they don't want to. I get that. If you have a wonderfully detailed horror game in mind that you want to run, and there's going to be some nasty critters in there, and they're going to do some disturbing things, the object being that the players are supposed to, number one, fear them, and number two, look for ways to permanently end them as a threat, because they're horror monsters, and horror monsters, that's pretty much what you have to try to be doing. Suppose you have something like that in mind, if somebody comes along and hands you one of these consent forms, and they've checked off no spiders, no bugs, definitely no eyeballs. And you had a campaign based on the movie Night Flyers where people pull their eyeballs out. I don't think the movie actually shows them doing it on screen, but you see the eyeballs laying around in various places. I mean, it's pretty obvious what's happened. Yeah, you've got a problem. You've got a player who does not want to be involved in the game you have designed. They want you to run a game for them, but according to their specifications. I understand why this makes the old guys mad. I'm one of them. I would not appreciate someone coming to my game and handing me a piece of paper that says, whatever you had planned, forget about it. You can't do the things you had in mind. And the short answer to that question is really very simple. Number one, if you fill the consent checklist out that way and you mark things like that you don't want to see involved in a game, the game master is not required to change his or her or their game to meet your requirements. Unless you're paying them to. Now, if you're paying your game master, that's a different story. Now it's a job. They're not doing it because they love the game or because they have a brilliant idea in mind that they really want to see play out. They're running it to make a buck and to make you happy, and making you happy is largely what matters, because you're one of the people paying their fee. I'm given to understand that that sessions can net hundreds of dollars for a game master. I can't imagine that. But if you're not paying them for it, why should the game master be required to meet your requirements? On the other hand, you as a game master are looking for players, and you are running a nasty horror game that you think is brilliant. If you can't find enough players with a stomach for your game, you may have to change it. They aren't required to play in your game your way. They're not required to put up with what you had in mind if they don't like it. As long as this is a hobbyist activity, that swings both ways. The game master does not have to follow the dictates of the players, but the players don't have to follow the dictates of the game master with respect to the game. And the answer to the question is, if you're not going to follow them, your choice is to leave. If you hand in a consent form and the game master says these items on your consent form are problematic, we're not going to be able to have you in the game, you have to decide, can you change? Can you flex on those things? If you can't, if your mental health will not tolerate that, then you need to walk away. You just need to walk away. Be cool about it. Understand that the game that you're trying to get into is not for you. If you as a game master can't fill your table because your game is too horrifying or too explicit or whatever, maybe you need to rethink that. If you can't get players because none of the players want anything to do with whatever's in your game, maybe it's not such a great game after all, or maybe you need to be looking in a wider field. Maybe you need to run your game online. There's probably people online that would like your game. But this is where you're at. This is where we're at with consent. Consent is consent in both directions. Game Master is not required to do what you've asked, but you're not required to play at their table. And alternately, the Game Master wants the table filled. They can't be too objectionable, or they're not going to be able to find enough players. It's just as simple as that. I would like to suggest that the rest of the people who are in my category, the rest of you people who are Gen X or Grunyers for whatever reason, who are prone to scoffing at consent forms, stop that. It's rude. Don't scoff at the consent forms. Don't make fun of them. Don't make fun of the people who want them. They have good reasons in their minds, in their world, in their lives for doing that. They have reasons why they believe that's a good idea. And again, it's consent. If you walk up to a table where they're running a game in game store or whatever, and the game master hands you a consent form and says, hey, before you can join the game, we need to verify that you're happy with the things we're going to do. Please fill this form out. Okay, it's not a tax form. There are a lot of questions on here, but it's not a tax form. Fill it out. Check some boxes. It won't take any time. Get your pencil out, mark up some stuff, sign your name on it, hand it to the game master, and say, this is what I'm comfortable with. And if you really are old school and all this stuff is fine with you and you're cool with freezing to death and being gaslit and seeing genocide happen, that's cool. Mark that. Do what you're asked to do or walk away from the table. Don't make fun of them. That's not appropriate. If you are in a generation or in a group or in a category where you think this is a good idea and you have your consent form in hand and you walk up to a table and the game master says, oh, we don't use those. Look down your list and ask a few questions. Specifically, focus on the things you're not comfortable with. That's where you need to be. Just say, I'm not comfortable with these items. Do you expect these items will be in your game? Is this something I should be concerned about? Game masters, if you are asked that question, answer it truthfully. Don't mess with your players. You're not there to be a troll. Trolls are in the game, not at the table. Tell them the truth. Tell them, yeah, we're going to have some of this. Yeah, some of this is unavoidable. This is how the game works. And the player should at that point have the good grace to walk away if they're not comfortable with your answers. On the other hand, if the player asks you, is there going to be explicit sex in your game? And you say, oh, no, we don't do that. That's cringy. You're good. The player can sit down at the table. We can have a game. That's great. Be honest about it. Being honest with each other is the smartest thing we can possibly do. If you are an old schooler and you had never thought about doing a session 0 and you don't do consent forms, but you want to bring in new players, you need to be prepared for the possibility that this may be how they think about it. This may be how they look at it. Try to be understanding. Or anticipate you're not going to be able to get those players. These are the options. So nobody is being forced or coerced by a consent checklist except possibly a paid GM. But even there, even in that situation, a paid GM who is hired to do the job, and if you hire a GM and you want to do a consent checklist, you need to have them look at your consent checklist before you pay them, because you probably ain't getting your money back. Show them your checklist, make sure they're cool with it, make sure they understand that they don't get paid if they transgress your checklist. I mean, it makes sense. If you don't do checklists, but there are things you're not comfortable with, it's still a good idea to ask. Find out how the game master's game works, if there are going to be any of the subjects you find uncomfortable potentially happening right in front of you in this game. If you're not comfortable with it, don't go. Don't pay the bill. Don't join. If you don't do what you're not comfortable with. I don't think it even matters which side of this argument you're on. Don't do what you're not comfortable with. Don't let anybody force you to do what you're not comfortable with. I think I've covered that. I think I've covered the subject pretty clearly. As always, my advice is, number one, be respectful of each other. Be respectful of what other people need, what they tell you they need. Do not make fun of someone for wanting a consent checklist. Do not pick on a game master who doesn't use them unless you find that they won't tell you honestly if the things that are on your checklist that you don't want to be involved in, if they won't honestly answer the question for you. I still wouldn't make fun of them, but you definitely shouldn't sit down at their table. Everybody needs to be prepared to find a comfort level. And everybody needs to be prepared to help each other find that comfort level. So yeah, I believe that covers it. Thank you all for listening. I hope everybody in the comments below is appropriately respectful of each other. I will be deleting comments from anybody who is disrespectful to me or to any other commenter. I don't usually have a problem with that, but I thought in this particular case, considering this is super contentious, situation that I should bring that up, that I should mention that. And you all have a nice day, and I will talk to you all later.